The humid dawn broke over the Bismarck Sea on March 3, 1943, as Japanese destroyer Captain Commander Hideo Kuboki took his position on the bridge of the Arashio, peering through the morning mist that clung to the water. Below him, sailors moved with urgent purpose, their bodies exhausted but their hands steady as they pulled oil-soaked survivors from the water. These men had belonged to the Kyoko Shimaru, a transport that had gone down the day before. The convoy, Operation 81, had already paid a price in blood. One ship lay at the bottom of the sea, courtesy of American B-17 bombers that had struck the previous afternoon. The mission was straightforward: deliver desperately needed reinforcements to Lae, New Guinea, and return safely. Kuboki and his fellow captains felt the worst was behind them. They were only hours from their destination now, and fighter protection from Lae should shield them through these final miles of dangerous water. Then, around 10 a.m., a lookout's shout pierced the morning air, a single word that would transform everything in the seconds that followed. Aircraft. What emerged from the southwestern horizon was unlike anything Kuboki had experienced in his years of naval service. These were not the high-altitude B-17s they had faced yesterday, those distant bombers that had dropped their ordnance from 5,000 feet, high enough that anti-aircraft crews at least had a theoretical chance to reach them. What approached now was something terrifyingly different. B-25 Mitchell bombers and Australian Beaufighters swept in from the southwest, flying so close to the sea that their propellers seemed to tear at the spray itself. They came at devastating speed, barely above water level, in a coordinated assault pattern that would fundamentally transform how naval warfare would be fought in the Pacific. In the span of mere seconds, the time required for a skip bomb with its 5-second delay fuse to bounce across the water surface, Captain Kuboki's world would collapse into chaos. The Arashio would be struck and crippled, her steering mechanisms destroyed, sending the vessel careening into an uncontrolled collision with the transport Nagima Maru. Within just 15 minutes, the entire convoy would be reduced to burning wreckage and sinking hulls. 7 transport vessels, each carrying thousands of desperately needed troops, would be consumed by fire or dragged beneath the waves. 4 of the 8 destroyer escorts would be destroyed or fatally damaged. This was far more than another routine convoy engagement. This was the moment when skip bombing, a revolutionary technique developed in secret by American innovators, would demonstrate conclusively that surface ships could no longer operate with any measure of safety within reach of land-based aircraft. For the Japanese captains who endured this attack, the experience would be forever remembered as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. 2 months earlier, in January 1943, the situation had appeared far less dire to the men making critical decisions in the headquarters of the 8th Area Army at Rabaul on New Britain. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura wrestled with an increasingly desperate strategic position. The Allies had just captured Buna on the New Guinea coast following months of savage fighting, and now they threatened the vital Japanese bases at Lae and Salamaua. These were not merely military outposts. They represented the foundation of Japan's entire defensive strategy throughout the southwestern Pacific, serving as protective barriers for Rabaul itself, that crucial fortress where nearly 100,000 Japanese troops stood ready for action. If Lae fell, the mathematics of warfare would become catastrophic. The Allies would possess an unobstructed pathway to advance northward along the New Guinea coast, eventually threatening the Philippines and ultimately the Japanese home islands. The survival of the empire hung on these positions, yet the logistics of maintaining them were brutally simple and brutally unforgiving. Every soldier, every bullet, every grain of rice destined for these remote outposts had to travel by ship from Rabaul across the treacherous waters of the Solomon and Bismarck Seas. Though the distance measured only 500 miles, the growing strength of Allied air power, operating from bases at Port Moresby and Milne Bay, made it feel infinitely greater. Previous attempts to reinforce the positions had yielded mixed results. On January 7th, a convoy transporting the 102nd Infantry Regiment under Major General Toru Akabe had managed to deliver its cargo to Lae, though not without paying a heavy price. The transport Natsushima had been sunk by an Australian Catalina flying boat, taking with it all of Akabe's medical supplies and 361 soldiers. The transport Meisho Maru had sustained such severe damage that it required beaching to prevent total loss. The cost in lives and resources to maintain these positions was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. General Imamura understood that decisive action was required. Intelligence reports warned that the Allies were preparing something larger than previous operations, a major offensive that would test Japanese defenses severely. To hold Leh, he needed to reinforce it with nothing less than a complete division. After tense deliberations with his staff and naval commanders, a strategy took shape. Operation 81 would be a single massive convoy operation, delivering 6,900 fresh troops of the 51st Division directly to Leh in one decisive push. The risks were acknowledged openly. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, the brilliant strategist who had conceived the Pearl Harbor attack, warned that losses might exceed 50%. Yet the alternatives seemed worse. Landing troops farther up the coast and forcing them to march through hostile jungle terrain would likely produce even greater casualties from disease, malnutrition, and Allied air attacks. The decision crystallized. The convoy would sail. Command of this critical operation fell to Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, leader of the 3rd Destroyer Squadron. At 54 years old, Kimura represented the cream of the Imperial Navy's destroyer commanders, a veteran whose experience encompassed countless night engagements in the Solomon Islands, where Japanese destroyers had demonstrated their tactical superiority repeatedly. The force assembled for Operation 81 was formidable. 8 of the Imperial Navy's most capable destroyers, each battle-tested from Guadalcanal. The Shirayuki carried Kimura's flag and would lead the formation, accompanied by the Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yugumokaze, Shikinami, Uranami, and Asagumo. These names struck fear into Allied sailors who had encountered them in darkness. Yet this operation would differ fundamentally from the rapid destroyer runs, what Americans called the Tokyo Express, that Kimura had perfected in the Solomon Islands. This time, his swift warships would be forced to shepherd 8 slow, defenseless transport vessels loaded with soldiers and supplies. The convoy's maximum speed would barely reach 7 knots, scarcely faster than a man could jog. For Kimura, accustomed to slashing through enemy waters at 30 knots, this pace must have felt like being anchored in place. Every hour remained a gamble, every hour increased the risk of detection. Every mile traveled in daylight invited air attack. 500 miles away in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, a very different military personality was wrestling with his own critical problem. Lieutenant General George Churchill Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, had been confronting a frustration that had plagued him since arriving in theater 6 months prior: how to sink ships from the air. Traditional high-level bombing had proven remarkably ineffective against moving vessels. During the January convoy battle, his bombers had flown 416 sorties and managed to destroy just 2 ships. A dismal return on effort that no business could accept, let alone a military operation locked in mortal struggle. Kenny recognized the fundamental truth: if he could not halt Japanese convoys from reinforcing their positions, MacArthur's planned offensive up the New Guinea coast would bog down into a protracted, blood-soaked stalemate. Yet Kenny did not think like a conventional military officer. Before the war, he had earned a reputation as something of a maverick, regularly finding himself in trouble for proposing radical ideas that challenged accepted doctrine. In 1928, while teaching at the Air Corps Tactical School, he had theorized about a technique called skip bombing. The concept was elegant, dropping bombs from very low altitude so they would bounce across water like skipping stones and detonate against a ship's hull. The military establishment had dismissed the idea as far too dangerous, too impractical, too far removed from accepted bombing doctrine. Now, with American forces desperate to interdict Japanese shipping, Kenny determined that the moment had come to transform theory into operational reality. Developing skip bombing presented more than a technical problem. It represented a revolution in aerial warfare, demanding that pilots and tacticians completely rethink how bombers would attack ships. Major William Benn, commanding the 63rd Bombardment Squadron, became Kenny's primary test pilot for this revolutionary technique. Through repeated trials and adjustments, they discovered the optimal approach. Aircraft had to come in at between 200 to 250 feet altitude, maintaining speeds of 200 to 250 miles per hour. Bombs required release at 300 to 600 yards from the target, with a 4 to 5 second delay fuse. Too high, and the bomb would not skip properly. Too low, and the aircraft risked destruction from its own blast or debris thrown up from the target. The margin for error was essentially non-existent. Yet Kenny knew that skip bombing alone would never be sufficient. The bombers would face intense anti-aircraft fire during their low-level attacks, fire that had to be suppressed if any aircraft were to survive. This challenge brought another military innovator into the narrative. Major Paul Irvin Papin Gunn, a 43-year-old former Navy pilot, had become Kenny's source for unconventional tactical solutions. Gunn was already something of a legend in the southwestern Pacific. When the war began, he had been a civilian airline pilot in the Philippines. The Japanese had captured his family, imprisoning them at Santo Tomas prison camp in Manila. That personal tragedy had forged in him an intensely burning desire for vengeance against Japanese military forces. Yet his mechanical genius proved to be his greatest contribution. Taking a standard B-25 Mitchell bomber as his foundation, Gunn stripped out the bombardier's compartment in the nose and replaced it with 4 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. But he was just beginning. He added 2 more guns on each side of the fuselage and mounted 4 additional guns underneath, creating a flying gunship bristling with devastating forward-directed firepower. When Kenny observed Gunn's modified B-25, nicknamed Papa's Folly, he immediately grasped its potential. "Take everything out of the nose and fill it full of .50 caliber guns," he instructed Gunn. "I want you to strap more on the sides. Give me all the forward firepower you can manage. I want a skip bomber capable of overwhelming the deck defenses of a Japanese destroyer." Throughout February 1943, the modified bombers conducted relentless practice runs against the wreck of the SS Pruth, a passenger vessel that had run aground near Port Moresby back in 1923. Day after day, the B-25s roared in at mast height, their guns blazing, their bombs skipping across the water to slam into the rusted hull. The accuracy proved remarkable, far surpassing anything high-level bombing had ever achieved. Yet attacking a stationary wreck constituted an entirely different proposition from attacking a moving convoy of warships crewed by trained anti-aircraft teams and protected by fighter cover. The Australian contribution to this revolutionary tactic deserved recognition. Number 30, Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, piloting Bristol Beaufighters, had been developing its own low-level attack techniques. The Beaufighter, armed with 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, proved perfectly suited for suppressing ship defenses. Group Captain Bill Garing, an RAAF officer serving on Kenny's staff with extensive experience in anti-shipping operations from the European theatre, proposed a coordinated attack strategy. The Beaufighters would strike first at mast height, suppressing anti-aircraft positions with cannon and machine gun fire. The skip-bombing B-25s would follow immediately afterward. High-level B-17s would attack simultaneously from altitude, dividing enemy defensive fire and maximizing confusion below. On February 14th, reconnaissance photographs of Rabaul Harbour sent shockwaves through Allied headquarters. The images revealed 79 vessels crowded into the harbour, including 45 merchant ships and 6 large transports. A major convoy operation was clearly imminent. 2 days later, ultra-intelligence, the closely guarded Allied capability to decrypt Japanese coded messages, provided the critical details that everyone needed. Naval code breakers working in Melbourne and Washington had successfully decrypted Japanese communications, revealing that a convoy would depart Rabaul on February 28th, with Leh as its destination, carrying major reinforcements from the 51st Division. The intercept even specified the convoy's planned route and its estimated arrival date of March 5th. Kenny immediately recognized this moment as the opportunity he had been awaiting, a chance to test his new tactics in a definitive engagement. He summoned his key commanders to Port Moresby for a final planning conference. Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead, Kenny's deputy and commander of the advance element in New Guinea, would coordinate the attack. The plan called for maximum effort from every available aircraft in theatre: 90 heavy bombers, comprising B-17s and B-24s, 41 medium bombers, including B-25s, 34 light bombers consisting of A-20 Havocs, and 54 fighters comprising P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks. In total, 219 aircraft would be committed against the convoy, the largest coordinated airstrike yet attempted in the southwestern Pacific. The Allied pilots approached the coming battle with mixed emotions, excitement tempered by genuine apprehension. Skip bombing remained experimental technology, and many pilots had never attempted the technique in actual combat. Lieutenant Charles Howe of the 3rd Attack Group expressed the concern many felt quietly. "We're going to be sitting ducks coming in that low. One lucky hit from a destroyer's guns and we're finished," he said. Major Ed Larner, who would lead the skip bombing attack himself, projected a very different confidence. "We've trained for this," he assured his pilots. "Trust the plan. Go in fast, hit hard, and get out. The Beaufighters will clear the way for us." Back in Rabaul, the Japanese convoy made final preparations with meticulous precision. Each transport ship was combat-loaded, meaning equipment and supplies were packed in reverse order of need, allowing for the most rapid possible unloading once Leh was reached. The 5,954 soldiers of the 51st Division's 115th Regiment boarded their assigned transports, the Ayomaru, Kembu Maru, Nagima Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, and Teo Maru. An 8th transport, the Natsushima, carried aviation fuel and supplies urgently needed by Japanese air units already stationed at Leh. The destroyers themselves carried an additional 958 troops, packed into every available compartment and corridor. The human cargo included some of the Japanese Army's most important commanders stationed in New Guinea. Lieutenant General Hatazawa Dachi, commander of the entire 18th Army, took passage aboard the destroyer Tokitsukaze. Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, commanding the 51st Division, traveled on the Yugumo Kaze, accompanied by his complete divisional staff. The concentration of senior leadership within a single convoy was unusual and reflected both Japanese confidence and desperation. Confidence that their destroyers possessed the capability to protect the convoy, desperation to position these commanders at Leh, where their presence was urgently required to stabilize the deteriorating situation. Admiral Kimura's operational plan reflected hard-won lessons extracted from previous convoy operations. To avoid taking the direct route straight across the Solomon Sea, a path that would leave them exposed to air attacks for far too long, the convoy would travel a longer way around. The ships would head north from Rabaul first, then curve west along New Britain's northern coast, where the island's towering mountains would shield them from Allied radar while offering some protection against aircraft approaching from above. The journey's final stretch would prove the most treacherous of all, sailing south through the narrow Viti Strait, followed by a desperate push along the Huon Gulf coast toward Leh. That strait, squeezed down to just 50 miles across at its narrowest point, would force the convoy into a predictable corridor where Japanese pilots knew they'd be sitting targets. To counter this threat, the Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, based at Rabaul, promised 100 fighters flying constant patrols above the ships. Yet this commitment brought serious complications of its own. The flight distance from Rabaul to the Viti Strait stretched fighters to their absolute limit. Pilots could hover above the convoy for only brief stretches before fuel gauges demanded they turn back toward base. Many of the men flying those missions were running on empty themselves. Months of relentless combat had worn them down physically and mentally. Their planes, too, showed signs of exhaustion, spare parts becoming harder to find by the day. The truth was simpler and grimmer. The convoy would have real air protection only during portions of the voyage. When evening arrived on February 28, 1943, as tropical darkness rolled across Simpson Harbor, the massive fleet began moving away from the dock. Transport ships pulled slowly from their moorings one by one, their decks packed with soldiers who likely sensed they were seeing Rabaul's familiar shoreline for the last time. Destroyers moved in protective circles around them, crews standing ready at their battle stations even though they remained in supposedly safe waters. Submarine attacks had happened before, even this close to friendly harbors. Rear Admiral Kimura, positioned on the bridge of his flagship Shirayuki, observed his ships arranging themselves into two parallel columns. Destroyers took positions along the flanks and forward of the formation. When midnight arrived, Kimura gave the order. The convoy would move ahead at 7 knots, steering a course of 350 degrees into the vast darkness of the Bismarck Sea. The first 24 hours brought no attacks. Weather, so often an enemy to sailors, became an unexpected ally. 2 tropical storms swept across the Solomon and Bismarck Seas, bringing thick clouds and heavy rain that covered the convoy from American reconnaissance planes overhead. The Japanese sailors and soldiers, many already fighting waves of seasickness from the sluggish rolling of their overloaded ships, nonetheless felt genuine relief with each passing hour. Every moment without being discovered meant they might actually reach their destination. But Kimura knew better than to trust in luck forever. The storms were clearing. Tomorrow would likely bring blue skies, and with clear weather came American bombers. His instincts proved accurate. By 3 o'clock on March 1st, as the convoy rounded Cape Gloucester at New Britain's western edge and turned south toward the Viti Strait, the clouds parted just long enough. At precisely that moment, a B-24 Liberator from the 91st Bombardment Group, piloted by Lieutenant Walter Higgins, happened to pass overhead on a routine patrol mission. Higgins watched the ocean below in disbelief. 8 transports, 8 destroyers. Everything the intelligence reports had predicted they'd find. He grabbed his radio immediately and sent the contact report that would trigger one of the Pacific War's most significant air and sea clashes. At 5th Air Force headquarters in Port Moresby, electricity filled the room the instant Higgins's message arrived. General Kenny wasted no time. He ordered the attack plan they'd been rehearsing to be put into motion right away. Yet a problem emerged. The convoy had been spotted ahead of schedule, still north of the Viti Strait, where Japanese fighters from New Britain could cover them more effectively. Whitehead needed to make a crucial call. High-altitude B-17s would strike first with standard bombing runs, designed to slow and damage the vessels. The skip bombing assault, the one that would truly decide things, would come tomorrow when the convoy moved through the tighter waters of the strait, where escape became almost impossible. Dawn arrived on March 2nd, and as the convoy continued through increasingly clear skies, the American assault began. 28 B-17 flying fortresses descended towards 6,500 feet, their formations tight despite roughly 30 Japanese fighters climbing to intercept them. The transport commanders, mostly civilian sailors drafted into military duty, could only watch in sick fascination as the enormous 4-engine aircraft opened their bomb doors. Water erupted in massive columns around the fleet as most bombs missed their marks, but numbers work in anyone's favor eventually. The transport Kyoko Sei Maru took a direct hit. The ship split apart like kindling and disappeared beneath the waves in minutes. A second transport suffered damage and began falling behind the main group. Captain Sato Yasuo, who commanded the destroyer Asashio and also led Destroyer Division 8, immediately maneuvered his ship toward the survivors thrashing in the oily water. His crew hauled out nearly 700 soldiers and sailors, cramming every inch of available deck space with desperate, gasping men. The rescue was brave and necessary, but it came with a cost. Asashio became dangerously overloaded and sluggish, her combat capabilities severely reduced by the human cargo now covering her deck. As darkness fell on March 2nd, Rear Admiral Kimura faced a decision that would change everything. The convoy remained 12 hours away from Leh, but they'd already lost one transport and damaged others. Should he maintain formation with the crippled vessels, keeping everyone together but vulnerable for much longer? Or should faster ships race ahead, splitting the group but getting at least some troops to safety sooner? Kimura chose to hold the group intact. He transmitted orders to all captains: keep formation, we reach Leh together. What Kimura didn't know was that Allied intelligence had intercepted and decoded his message. Kenny and Whitehead now possessed exact information about where the convoy would be at sunrise, how fast it would travel, how it would be arranged. Everything was falling into place for an attack method nobody had ever tried before in naval warfare. That night, Allied pilots and crew members gathered for final mission briefings. The air hung thick with tension as men examined their aircraft one last time, going through their routines with mechanical precision. Many pulled out paper and pen to write letters home, fully aware that the coming dawn would demand they fly directly into Japanese gunfire. When March 3rd arrived, the sun broke across the Bismarck Sea under clear, still conditions, ideal for flying. The surviving transports, now confined to the restricted waters approaching the Huon Gulf, held their steady 7-knot pace toward Leh, now only hours distant. The remaining ships had drawn their formation tighter, destroyers positioned like protective shepherds, circling a vulnerable flock. Rear Admiral Kimura had issued strict orders. All crews must maintain disciplined anti-aircraft defense. Guns would fire only when given permission, preserving ammunition for the major battle he knew was coming. At 10 in the morning, the first wave of Allied aircraft appeared along the horizon. But this was nothing like what the Japanese expected. 13 Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, led by squadron leader Claude Ridley, came roaring in at wave-top height, so near the water that their propeller wash carved white scratches across the calm surface. Behind them, visible as dark specks against the brilliant morning sky, came the B-25s of the attack group. On Asashio's bridge, Commander Hideo Kuboki had mere seconds to comprehend what his eyes were seeing and somehow respond. His mind, trained by years of naval command, raced through impossible calculations. The speed and angle of the incoming fighters, the physical limitations of his guns which couldn't angle downward far enough to hit targets at sea level, the requirement to keep his ship maneuvering while still protecting the transports. But seconds weren't enough time for any of it. The Beaufighters were suddenly on top of him. Their 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns exploded with overwhelming violence across Asashio's deck. The assault was brutally focused and devastatingly effective. Cannon rounds tore through the anti-aircraft gun crews before most could even react, killing or wounding nearly all of them. Machine gun fire swept the bridge, shattering glass and cutting down officers and signalmen in seconds. In one terrible moment, Asashio's defensive capability was shattered, but the Beaufighters were only the beginning. Right behind came the B-25s, each carrying twin 500-pound bombs equipped with 5-second delay fuses. Their nose guns were already blazing. Major Ed Lana led the B-25 formation. His modified bomber roared toward the destroyer Shirayuki at 220 miles per hour, flying at barely 50 feet above the water. Through his targeting sight, Lana could see Japanese sailors scattered across the deck, some manning weapons, others diving desperately for cover. When Lana was 300 yards away, he released his bombs and hauled back hard on the stick, the bomber's belly skimming past the destroyer's mast with feet to spare. Behind him, his bombs bounced across the water surface once, twice, then slammed directly into Shirayuki's side just below the waterline. The damage was instantly catastrophic. The bombs punched through the destroyer's relatively thin armor before detonating inside her hull. The explosions, confined within the ship's tight internal spaces, created devastating force. Shirayuki's stern section was effectively torn away. Her rear ammunition magazine erupted in a massive explosion that hurled debris and bodies hundreds of feet into the air. In minutes, Rear Admiral Kimura's flagship was going down, drowning many crew members in her death spiral. Kimura himself, wounded by shrapnel fragments, was fished from the water by sailors from the destroyer Shirayuki Nami. The assault unfolded with almost balletic coordination, deadly beautiful in its precision. As Beaufighters and B-25s raced through the convoy at sea level, far above them, B-17s from the 43rd Bombardment Group released their loads from 7,000 feet. The convoy's anti-aircraft gunners, those still breathing and able to fight, confronted an impossible decision: concentrate fire on the low-level attackers who posed immediate danger, or attempt to disrupt high-altitude bombers overhead. Most chose to focus downward, filling the sky with tracer fire and explosions. But the B-25s moved too quickly and flew too low for effective engagement. Lieutenant Charles Howe, commanding his B-25 named Chatterbox, selected the transport Tio Maru as his target. The vessel, crammed with over 1,000 soldiers, was trying desperately to turn away from the onslaught, her wake showing a frantic spiral as the captain fought to offer a smaller profile. But at skip bombing speed and altitude, such maneuvers were meaningless. Howe's bombs tracked perfectly. One struck amidships, the other near the stern. Tio Maru seemed to jump from the water as explosions tore through her structure, then started settling rapidly, tilting heavily to port. Within 5 minutes, she'd capsized completely, trapping countless soldiers still trapped below her decks. The destroyer Tokitsukaze, which carried Lieutenant General Adachi, became the target of 3 B-25s diving at her simultaneously. Her captain, Commander Masayoshi Motokura, made a brave decision. He positioned his ship directly between the attackers and the nearby transports. It was a courageous but ultimately useless sacrifice. Multiple bomb impacts left Tokitsukaze dead and motionless in the water. Her engine compartments flooded, fires spreading amidships and threatening to engulf the entire vessel. General Adachi, somehow untouched, was transferred to the destroyer Yukikaze for safety. But 19 of Tokitsukaze's crew didn't survive the bombing and strafing. Commander Kuboki's already wounded Asashio next faced the B-25s. One bomb destroyed her steering mechanism, sending the destroyer into an uncontrolled spin that resulted in a violent collision with the transport Nojima Maru. The two ships, locked together by twisted metal and the force of impact, became helpless targets for the next wave. Both were abandoned. Their crews leapt into the water as flames consumed both vessels. Throughout this terrible destruction, individual moments of courage and horror played out across the scene. On the transport Kenbu Maru, soldiers from the 51st Division, most experiencing combat for the very first time, struggled to deploy life rafts as the ship tilted increasingly to starboard. Their officers, swords drawn, attempted to maintain some order in the chaos, but panic was spreading rapidly. The reality was becoming impossible to ignore. They were hundreds of miles from any friendly shore in waters known for sharks, and American planes were methodically eliminating every ship that might save them. The destroyer Asashio, her decks still crammed with rescued soldiers from yesterday's sinking, fought back hard. Her captain, Captain Satoya Soho, commander of Destroyer Division 8, ordered every working weapon to fire at the incoming aircraft, creating a wall of steel that forced some B-25s to break off their runs. But sheer numbers were overwhelming. A B-17, nearly forgotten in the frenzy of the low-level assault, placed a 500-pound bomb directly on Asashio's forward section. The explosion, combined with the hundreds of extra men still crammed aboard, caused catastrophic flooding. Captain Satoya, honoring the samurai code, chose to remain with his ship as it went under. Those who survived reported his final words, "I'm tired, just let me rest peacefully here." Asashio sank with terrible loss of life. Not only her own crew, but many of the soldiers she'd rescued just yesterday. Captain Satoya would later be promoted posthumously to Vice Admiral for his heroic sacrifice. By 10:15 in the morning, just 15 minutes after the attack commenced, the convoy had effectively ceased to exist as an organized formation. 7 transports were either sinking or already on the bottom, their oil and wreckage spreading across miles of dark water. The 4 surviving destroyers, Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo, weaved desperately through the chaos of burning wreckage and oil slicks, their crews working frantically to haul men from the sea. But the ocean was a graveyard now, packed with struggling soldiers, and the handful of ships couldn't possibly save them all. Too many voices crying out, too few hands to reach down. When the second wave of Allied aircraft swept in around 2 in the afternoon, the scene that greeted them was apocalyptic. Square miles of ocean lay blackened with oil, burning vessels marked the water like funeral pyres. Debris scattered everywhere. The Japanese destroyers that had been conducting rescue operations were forced to abandon the men they'd just pulled from the water. Guns crews scrambled to battle stations. The destroyers had to choose, save lives or fight for survival. The transport Oigawa Maru, which had somehow remained afloat despite the pounding it had already taken, was finished off in a series of skip-bombing runs. The destroyer Asashio went down, taking Captain Satoya with her into the deep, becoming nothing more than a war grave as crude oil continued to bubble and rise from the twisted metal below. When darkness fell on that first day of March, the true magnitude of the catastrophe became unmistakable. Of the 6,900 troops who had set out from Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 would ever reach Leh. The surviving destroyers worked through the night, pulling nearly 2,700 men from the water and making plans to return them to Rabaul. But almost 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors would never come home. They were gone, killed in the fighting or lost to the sea, their bodies drifting in waters that had turned red and black. The reinforcement force, so carefully assembled to strengthen the defences of New Guinea, had been obliterated in a single day of battle. What followed was both controversial and undeniably decisive. By March 4th, American PT boats and aircraft continued to patrol the battle zone, attacking anything floating on the surface. The official explanation was straightforward: prevent Japanese troops from reaching shore, deny them the chance to reinforce Leh. But many Allied pilots were deeply troubled by what they were witnessing. Helpless men clinging to debris, trying desperately to stay alive, only to face another burst of machine gun fire. The line between warfare and slaughter had become impossibly blurred. This moral complexity, the way modern war had transformed from a contest between armed combatants into the systematic destruction of human beings, would haunt many of these men for the remainder of their lives. Some would never truly recover from it. For the Japanese Navy, the Bismarck Sea battle represented nothing less than a complete transformation of naval warfare. Admiral Matomi Ogaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, recorded his thoughts in his diary with unmistakable grimness. "We have lost the freedom to move anywhere within range of enemy land-based aircraft. The convoy system that has supported our logistics throughout this entire war is finished. It is no longer viable." The Japanese would never again attempt to send large convoys in daylight. What came next were the rat runs, fast destroyers and submarines, operating only under darkness, making quick dashes to isolated positions. It was all that remained of Japan's supply system. The skip bombing technique itself revolutionized how the Allies would wage war against Japanese shipping throughout the entire Pacific. General Kenny's innovation, born out of desperation and pure necessity, proved something crucial. Land-based aircraft, when properly equipped and trained, could control sea lanes every bit as effectively as any naval fleet. Within months, skip bombing would be deployed from the Solomon Islands all the way to the Philippines. Japanese cargo ships faced increasingly devastating attacks. Their movements became ever more dangerous and ultimately unsustainable. For Major Paul Gunn, the architect of the B-25 modifications that made it all possible, this battle was both a professional triumph and something deeply personal. His family remained imprisoned in the Philippines, held by the Japanese. Every ship he helped sink brought their liberation one step closer. He continued to innovate, developing new weapons and new tactics that would make Allied aircraft deadlier with each passing month. North American Aviation, the manufacturer of the B-25, began integrating Gunn's gunship modifications directly into their production lines. Purpose-built gunships rolled off the assembly lines, aircraft designed from the ground up to hunt and destroy Japanese shipping. They would terrorize enemy convoys for the remainder of the war. The strategic repercussions of the disaster spread throughout the entire Japanese command structure. On March 25, 1943, Imperial General Headquarters issued a new directive that elevated the defense of New Guinea above all other operations. But without the ability to reinforce and resupply positions by sea, the directive was essentially meaningless. The Japanese garrisons at Leh, Salamaua, and positions up and down the New Guinea coast were now effectively cut off, forced to fight and die where they stood with dwindling supplies and no hope of relief. Lieutenant General Adachi, who survived the sinking of the Tokutsukaze, managed to reach Leh with fewer than 1,200 troops, less than a fifth of the force that had departed Rabaul. His 18th Army, already undermanned and starving for supplies, now faced an expanding Allied force with virtually no possibility of receiving meaningful reinforcement. In his first report back to headquarters, Adachi's assessment was bleak and unambiguous. The situation is beyond recovery by normal means. He proved to be correct. Within half a year, Leh fell to Allied forces advancing across land and through the air. The individual tales of survival from that day were both remarkable and devastating. Captain Tamachi Hara of the destroyer Amatsukaze, which had not been part of the convoy, later sought out survivors and recorded their experiences. One soldier from the 51st Division described clinging to wreckage for 3 days before finally washing ashore on an island still held by Japanese forces. Of the 12 men who had started on the same piece of debris, only 3 made it. The others had been claimed by sharks, by exhaustion, or by despair. Such stories began to emerge as survivors filtered in over the following weeks. Rear Admiral Kimura, badly wounded but alive, escaped official punishment for the convoy's destruction. The Japanese High Command understood that he had faced an impossible situation against an enemy with overwhelming air superiority. But he never commanded another convoy operation again. The psychological weight of watching his entire force annihilated in minutes by a new form of warfare he could neither anticipate nor counter had broken something fundamental in this veteran officer. He spent the remainder of the war in administrative positions, eternally haunted by memories of the Bismarck Sea. The American pilots who flew that day became instant legends throughout the Southwest Pacific. Major Ed Lana was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for leading the skip bombing attack. Yet many of those same pilots harbored deep reservations about their victory. Lieutenant Charles Howe wrote to his wife with visible conflict, "We destroyed them completely. It was necessary, I know, but I can't forget the sight of all those men struggling in the water. This isn't the kind of war I thought I'd be fighting." General MacArthur, always the consummate showman, issued a triumphant communiqué claiming the destruction of 22 ships and 15,000 Japanese troops. These numbers were wildly inflated. The actual losses were 8 transports, 4 destroyers, and roughly 3,000 men. But the propaganda value was enormous. The narrative was one of revenge for Pearl Harbor, evidence that American courage and ingenuity could overcome Japanese military superiority. The reality, as it always is in war, was far more complicated. The Australians who participated, particularly the Beaufighter crews of No. 30 Squadron, saw the victory as validation of their own critical contributions to the Pacific Campaign. Often overshadowed by American operations, the RAF had played a crucial role in suppressing Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, making the skip bombing attacks possible in the first place. Squadron leader Claude Ridley was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, but like his American counterparts, he felt troubled by how lopsided the engagement had been. "It wasn't a fight," he would later say. "It was an execution." The Japanese army responded to the disaster by blaming the Navy for failing to provide adequate protection. This reignited the bitter inter-service rivalry that had plagued the Japanese military throughout the war. Army commanders insisted the Navy should have committed aircraft carriers to provide cover, conveniently ignoring the fact that Japan's carrier forces were already stretched far beyond their breaking point. The Navy fired back that the Army's insistence on conducting daylight convoy operations in the face of absolute Allied air dominance bordered on criminal negligence. This cycle of mutual blame prevented any serious effort to develop effective counter-tactics to skip bombing. Strategically, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved to be as significant a turning point as Midway or Guadalcanal had been. It conclusively demonstrated that air power, when properly employed, could control sea lanes and trade routes every bit as effectively as any traditional naval fleet. For island nations dependent on maritime trade and supply lines, Japan, Britain, and others, this represented a revolution in warfare with profound implications. The age of the battleship was ending. The age of the aircraft was truly beginning. The technical lessons drawn from the battle drove rapid innovation on both sides. The Allies refined their skip bombing techniques further, developing new bomb sites and refining training procedures to achieve even greater accuracy. They began experimenting with rockets and larger caliber weapons, seeking to penetrate the armor of even the most heavily defended warships. The Japanese, recognizing the threat belatedly, attempted to develop countermeasures: barrage balloons, smoke screens, specialized anti-aircraft ammunition designed to engage low-flying targets. But these responses came too late and proved insufficient. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the aftermath centered on the families of the dead. In Japan, where official casualty reports were heavily censored, countless families waited months or even years to learn the fates of their loved ones. Mrs. Yamada, whose husband had been aboard the transport Taomaru, received only a terse notice that he had died gloriously for the Emperor in the South Seas. She never learned the details, the terror of the skip-bombing runs, the horror of the ship going down, the desperate struggle in oil-covered water among sharks and drowning men. Perhaps in some ways that ignorance was a mercy. For the Allied codebreakers who had provided the crucial intelligence making the victory possible, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea validated their entire operation. The ability to read Japanese naval codes gave the Allies an overwhelming advantage, allowing them to concentrate forces at exactly the right moment and location. But this success carried enormous risk. If the Japanese discovered their codes were compromised, they would change them, blinding Allied intelligence operations. Meticulous care was taken to ensure the victory appeared to result from fortunate reconnaissance rather than code-breaking. The propaganda war that erupted following the battle proved almost as intense as the combat itself. Tokyo Radio insisted the convoy had successfully delivered its troops to Leh with minimal losses, that American claims of victory were nothing but laughable lies. But the Japanese soldiers stationed at Leh knew the truth. They saw the pitiful remnants of what was supposed to be their relief force arriving in dribs and drabs. They understood with crushing clarity that they were now truly on their own. Morale, already fragile after months of jungle warfare and inadequate rations, deteriorated further. In Washington and Canberra, the victory was seized upon as proof that the tide had shifted in the Pacific. Political leaders who had harbored doubts about MacArthur's ambitious plans for advancing through New Guinea became convinced believers. Resources previously earmarked for other theaters were redirected to the Southwest Pacific. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea effectively validated MacArthur's overall strategy and ensured that his drive through New Guinea and eventually the Philippines would receive the support it required. The environmental consequences of the battle, though barely considered at the time, were substantial. Thousands of tons of crude oil from the sunken vessels spread across the Bismarck Sea, contaminating beaches and reefs for hundreds of miles. The wrecks themselves, still loaded with ammunition and supplies, became underwater tombs and persistent environmental hazards. Contemporary surveys of the battle area reveal ships still sitting upright on the bottom, their holds filled with trucks, ammunition, and the remains of those who perished with them. For military historians and strategists, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a classic case study in how warfare evolves. It demonstrated the critical importance of innovation, the irreplaceable value of superior intelligence, and the decisive power of air superiority when properly applied. War colleges across the globe analyzed the engagement, drawing conclusions about the vulnerability of surface vessels to air attack, the necessity of controlling the skies, and the imperative for coordination between air and naval forces. The personal acts of courage displayed by individuals on both sides deserve recognition and remembrance. Japanese destroyer captains positioned their ships between the transports and incoming attacks, knowing death was probable. Allied pilots flew through sheets of anti-aircraft fire at near point-blank range. Sailors on both sides risked their lives pulling oil-covered survivors from shark-infested waters. War reveals humanity's capacity for brutality, but also sometimes its capacity for selfless courage. As the war continued, veterans of the Bismarck Sea battle dispersed across the Pacific. Some participated in the island-hopping campaigns through the Solomon Islands and toward the Philippines. Others were assigned to training duties, instructing new generations of pilots in the hard-won lessons of skip bombing. Some, burned out by the relentless intensity of combat, were rotated home carrying both physical and psychological wounds that would never entirely heal. General Kenny rose to greater prominence, eventually commanding all Allied air forces throughout the Pacific theater. But he always considered the Bismarck Sea his crowning achievement, the battle that irrefutably proved air power could dominate maritime warfare. Years later, in his memoirs, he reflected with satisfaction, "We changed the nature of war that day. Ships could no longer operate within range of land-based aircraft unless they controlled the skies above them. It was a lesson written in blood, but one that absolutely had to be learned." For Japan, the Bismarck Sea battle was a catastrophe from which they never truly recovered. The loss of an entire division's worth of troops and equipment, combined with the psychological devastation of the defeat, marked the beginning of the end for Japanese positions throughout New Guinea. Within a year, most of their garrisons faced either destruction or isolation, left to starve in unforgiving jungle terrain as the war advanced beyond them. The dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere died in those oil-slicked waters. The technological revolution initiated by skip bombing extended far beyond the end of the war. Modern anti-ship missiles employ essentially the same principle: rapid approach at low altitude to evade detection and defensive systems. The modified B-25s of 1943, with their improvised gunship configurations and skip bombing tactics, represent the direct ancestors of contemporary maritime strike aircraft. The fundamental lesson remains unchanged and relevant. Innovation and adaptation can overcome even seemingly insurmountable challenges. This truth proved as vital in 1943 as it remains today. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea lives on in different forms, in different memories. For the Allies, it represents a triumph of innovation and courage, evidence that they could defeat Japan's finest forces. For Japan, it marks the beginning of their inevitable decline in the Pacific. For military analysts and historians, it stands as a pivotal moment when air power finally and definitively replaced naval surface forces as the dominant factor in maritime warfare. The waters of the Bismarck Sea, still holding the wrecks of ships and the remains of thousands, continue to bear silent witness to that transformation. For the Japanese military, this battle represents a catastrophe that captures the brutal predicament they had found themselves in. Their forces were vastly outnumbered, lacking sufficient firepower, and confronting an adversary whose technological reach and industrial capacity expanded relentlessly with every passing day. For those left behind, the wives, parents, and children of the fallen on both sides, March 3rd simply marked the moment everything shattered, when husbands, brothers, and sons vanished into the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The waters of the Bismarck Sea now lie tranquil and still. Fishing vessels pass through routinely, joined occasionally by research boats examining the remnants of sunken vessels resting below. Yet for those familiar with what transpired here, those who grasp the significance of that March morning in 1943, this seascape conveys something far more profound and troubling. These waters speak silently of desperation breeding invention, of men confronting certain annihilation with unwavering resolve, of war's merciless mathematics where triumph gets measured in tonnage, destroyed, and bodies lost. They testify to a reality often overlooked. Every military advancement, every tactical success achieved, carries a human dimension that defies complete comprehension or compensation. The battle's consequences extended well beyond strategic calculations into deeper territories of moral philosophy and the laws governing armed conflict. The deliberate targeting of shipwreck survivors, even when presented as militarily necessary, provokes troubling reflections about warfare's boundaries. What separates legitimate military action from humanitarian obligation? Can decisions be simultaneously tactically sound and ethically questionable? These unsettling dilemmas, initially confronted in the aftermath of the Bismarck Sea engagement, persist in challenging military strategists and moral philosophers today. For those who endured it, the struggle never truly concludes. Decades afterward, aging Japanese veterans still jolt awake from nightmares featuring B-25 bombers approaching at masthead height, their skip bombs descending with relentless precision. American pilots carry haunting images of Japanese seamen flailing in the ocean, tormented by uncertainty about whether different choices might have altered outcomes. Australian aircrew members still hear the percussion of machine gun fire ripping through metal plating and human bodies alike. These invisible scars, real despite their invisibility, perhaps constitute the engagement's most enduring psychological consequence. The battle's strategic reverberations extended throughout the remainder of Pacific combat operations. Japanese inability to deliver reinforcements to their outlying garrisons permitted Allied commanders to press forward at accelerated pace, island-hopping their way across territory that otherwise would have demanded costly direct confrontations. This advantageous momentum preserved countless American and Australian lives, a consequence of Bismarck Sea's decisive outcome. Yet this grim arithmetic, Japanese casualties exchanged for Allied survival, imposes its own moral weight. Military institutions across the globe now examine the Bismarck Sea as an exemplary case study, demonstrating what modern strategic theorists term effects-based operations, whereby limited resources applied with surgical precision accomplish what overwhelming numerical superiority once required. The engagement exemplified that a smaller, cleverly executed force could overwhelm a substantially larger one through superior tactics and flawless coordination. This principle resonates powerfully in contemporary military contexts, emphasizing precise munitions and financial constraints. The environmental consequences continue manifesting progressively. The wrecks deteriorate gradually, discharging petroleum products and other hazardous substances into surrounding marine habitats. Unexploded ordnance poses ongoing hazards to local fishermen and underwater explorers. Initiatives aimed at cataloging and preserving these sites as maritime memorials confront obstacles from black market salvage hunters pursuing valuable metals. In this sense, the engagement persists as an ongoing destroyer, claiming casualties long after surviving participants have departed. National memory of the engagement diverges substantially depending on geography and national perspective. Australia recognizes it as confirmation that their Royal Air Force matched any aviation service globally. Within the United States, it frequently gets overshadowed by larger engagements such as Midway or the Philippine Sea. Throughout Japan, it remains largely relegated to historical obscurity. Merely one catastrophe amid countless others in a conflict concluding through atomic devastation. These contrasting interpretations illuminate broader patterns in how societies construct and preserve their military narratives. The contribution of intelligence gathering proves impossible to minimize. Codebreakers who deciphered Japanese communications, coast watchers reporting naval movements, reconnaissance aviators locating the convoy, each played indispensable roles in determining outcomes. This engagement illustrates that contemporary military success depends equally on information as on weaponry itself. Understanding enemy disposition and intentions provides advantages no amount of individual valor or technical skill can compensate for missing. The engagement encompassed more than participating combatants. Indigenous populations inhabiting New Guinea and neighboring regions experienced both benefit and suffering. Salvageable materials from destroyed vessels and aircraft represented economic opportunity. Simultaneously, their traditional marine territories faced disruption, and industrial warfare's devastation reached their doorstep. Their experiences, largely unrecorded in standard accounts, constitute a vital element of the broader historical narrative. Examining this battle across 8 decades of historical distance, certain fundamental lessons crystallize. Perhaps foremost among them stands this reality: military innovation, though essential for success, invariably extracts human consequences. The skip bombing methodology, proving devastatingly effective, functioned fundamentally as a technique for executing mass fatality with heightened efficiency. The rebuilt B-25 aircraft that swept through Japanese formations represented nothing except instruments of destruction, regardless of how much we might appreciate the mechanical brilliance underlying their design. Simultaneously, we must consider the setting within which these developments occurred. The Allied coalition opposed a belligerent militaristic despotism that had initiated warfare across the Pacific without provocation. The Japanese soldiers heading to New Guinea represented occupation forces and soldiers of imperial conquest, rather than conscripted civilians. The straightforward moral framework characterizing Second World War conflict, regrettably absent from numerous subsequent disputes, supplies partial justification for Bismarck Sea's terrible effectiveness. The engagement simultaneously demonstrates warfare's adaptive dimension. Both combatant nations commenced Pacific operations harboring assumptions about naval conflict's nature, battleship formations engaging in climactic artillery duels with air support playing secondary roles. Practical experience negated these assumptions decisively. Those demonstrating flexibility, such as Kenny's unconventional aviators, achieved overwhelming success. Those adhering to conventional wisdom, particularly Japanese convoy commanders, convinced their destroyers sufficed against aerial assault, suffered catastrophic losses. Looking ahead, the Bismarck Sea engagement presents cautionary messages for contemporary military planners. It illustrates how swiftly technological supremacy shifts, how breakthroughs render existing military frameworks obsolete almost instantaneously. Within contemporary contexts emphasizing cyber operations, autonomous systems, and algorithmic warfare, Bismarck sees foundational principle that flexibility and continuous innovation determine military outcomes, maintains remarkable relevance. The particular experiences recounted by battle participants ground us in recognizing warfare's fundamentally individual character, not merely abstraction or geopolitical maneuvering. All 3,000 Japanese perishing in the Bismarck Sea maintained families, held aspirations, possessed particular dreams. All Allied aviation crews penetrating anti-aircraft barrages had loved ones anticipating their homecoming. Accumulating these singular devastations millions of times across the Pacific War reveals conflict's genuine expense. As the last generation directly experiencing this engagement passes from living memory, we inherit historical documentation, archival photographs, and subsequent interpretation. The danger emerges that the Bismarck Sea becomes merely another historical entry, emptied of its human substance, diminished to directional marks across tactical maps and numerical entries within academic texts. We must actively resist this dehumanization, maintaining awareness that actual human beings crafted decisions under enormous strain, frequently operating with fragmented understanding and contradictory moral pressures. The engagement's influence upon subsequent military architecture proved substantial. Skip bombing's achievement directly motivated expanded resources toward anti-shipping aircraft development and naval strike weaponry. Surface vessel vulnerability to airborne assault accelerated development of enhanced defensive systems, radar technology, and eventually missile-based air defenses. The continuing contest between advancing offensive aviation capabilities and modernized naval defense mechanisms began at Bismarck Sea and persists currently. For participating nations, the engagement became embedded within military heritage and organizational consciousness. The American Air Force identifies Bismarck Sea as supporting independent aviation operations. The Royal Australian Air Force considers it validation of coordinated joint combat effectiveness. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force examines it as instructive demonstration of naval vulnerability without adequate air cover. These competing narratives inform how contemporary militaries organize for approaching conflicts. The engagement's ethical complications retain contemporary significance. The targeting of shipwreck survivors, supposedly justified through military necessity preventing enemy reinforcement, challenges fundamental concepts of warfare conducted with restraint and dignity. The intentional destruction of transport vessels transporting soldiers introduces ambiguity regarding distinctions between military participants and non-combatants. These moral uncertainties, initially confronted following Bismarck Sea's conclusion, persist as military hardware grows progressively more destructive and capable of discrimination. Within the wider Pacific War's historical arc, the Bismarck Sea engagement constitutes a critical inflection point. It signified the juncture when Allied commanders obtained lasting dominance across southwestern Pacific territories, halting and subsequently reversing Japanese expansion. The psychological significance, confirming that Japanese formations could suffer not merely defeat, but complete destruction, transformed the war's emotional landscape, reinvigorating Allied determination while shattering Japanese morale. Following the Bismarck Sea, Japan's eventual defeat became certainty. Only the timeline and ultimate expense remained uncertain. The engagement equally demonstrates contemporary warfare's collaborative character. The Bismarck Sea success demanded seamless coordination connecting American and Australian forces, integrating air and sea components, linking intelligence professionals with tactical commanders. This integration, difficult to achieve operationally, generated extraordinary results under competent execution. Modern military doctrine's emphasis on interconnected joint operations traces descent partially from engagements like Bismarck Sea. For military historians, the engagement yields multiple instructive lessons. Intelligence's supremacy, Understanding opponent capabilities and intentions cannot be exaggerated, the strategic advantage flowing from willingness to experiment with unconventional methodologies, even approaches seeming potentially reckless. Contemporary conflicts' dependence on air superiority. Surface combatants' dangerous exposure to airborne attack, lacking sufficient protective systems. These principles extracted through enormous suffering in 1943 maintain immediate applicability for strategists crafting current security frameworks. The engagement showcases humanity's simultaneous capacity for invention and devastation. Skip bombing techniques and modified gunship B-25s displayed human ingenuity channeled toward warfare. Pilots navigating anti-aircraft fire and mariners recovering survivors from burning vessels demonstrated extraordinary valor under catastrophic circumstances. Those suffocating amid burning compartments or drowning beneath petroleum-covered surfaces illustrate warfare's genuine expenses. As we complete examination of the Bismarck Sea's significance, acknowledging its fundamental complexity becomes essential. The engagement was simultaneously a tactical masterpiece and a human catastrophe, an exhibition of mechanical innovation and an expression of devastation, a militarily justified operation and a moral trial. These contradictions do not uniquely characterize Bismarck Sea. They pervade all combat, though they achieve particular sharpness when success appears so complete and human suffering so immediate and tangible. The consequences of those compressed moments, the few seconds when Japanese commanders perceived skip bombing B-25s approaching, calculating frantically with 5-second fuse delays, extended far beyond immediate circumstances. Within those seconds, maritime warfare itself transformed fundamentally. The historical period when surface vessels enjoyed operational security ended abruptly. Airborne superiority superseded naval dominance conclusively. The necessity for continuing innovation and tactical experimentation received irrefutable demonstration. Presently, as tensions escalate within the identical Pacific waters hosting the Bismarck Sea engagement, 1943's instructional principles maintain continuing applicability. Airborne dominance's criticality, naval formation vulnerability toward precision munitions, intelligence and reconnaissance's irreplaceable function, all illuminated at Bismarck Sea, continue directing military preparation and strategic doctrine. The Bismarck Sea's legacy contains lessons persisting today, should we demonstrate willingness to genuinely absorb them. Commemorating the engagement requires honoring not exclusively victorious participants, but all contributors, acknowledging demonstrated bravery, respecting casualties, and drawing wisdom from accumulated experiences. The battle signifies that warfare, however occasionally unavoidable, always constitutes tragedy. The demonstrated innovation and individual bravery merit appreciation, yet the accompanying mortality and ruin should intensify commitment toward identifying alternative approaches for resolving international disputes. The account beginning with Admiral Yamamoto's increasingly desperate convoy and advancing through General Kenny's pioneering bombing innovations, encompassing individual pilots and sailors exhibiting extraordinary courage alongside thousands experiencing death, fundamentally constitutes a narrative about human beings. It clarifies that underneath every military technique, beneath every tactical accomplishment and strategic calculation, exist actual individuals whose trajectories experienced permanent alteration. Within those brief moments permitting Japanese officers to react, encompassed within the 15 minutes decimating a convoy, complete worlds terminated and historical development pivoted in novel directions. This represents the genuine significance of the Bismarck Sea engagement, extending beyond strategic principles and tactical instruction towards something more fundamental. Consciousness that warfare constitutes humanity's grimmest undertaking, demanding our highest capacities while simultaneously revealing our destructive potential. Contemplating uncertain prospects ahead, the engagement's teachings regarding innovation, flexibility, and conflict's human consequences remain profoundly applicable currently. No less than during that crystalline March morning in 1943, when low-flying B-25s executing skip bombing descended through clear skies and permanently transformed naval combat. Those Japanese and Allied servicemen, soldiers, aviators, seamen, Marines, deserving commemoration merit remembrance as particular individuals occupying historical moments rather than statistical abstractions. Their contributions, whether chosen or compelled, whether resulting in success or defeat, participated in constructing contemporary civilization. They merit not exclusively symbolic recognition, but meaningful comprehension. And beyond ceremonial regard, we owe commitment towards studying their encounters so we might construct existence characterized by diminished suffering and expanded tranquility. Presently, as daylight fades across the Bismarck Sea, the ocean surface appears serene and undisturbed. Visualizing the brutality and dread of March 3, 1943, requires imagination. Submerged beneath those tranquil surfaces rest vessel wreckage and human remains, wordless monuments honoring one of Pacific conflict's most consequential engagements. Their continuous presence communicates that contemporary liberty and material comfort emerged through terrible sacrifice, establishing moral obligation regarding those who bore such expense. We must exercise our autonomy thoughtfully and dedicate ourselves toward establishing circumstances where equivalent sacrifices become unnecessary. The Bismarck Sea engagement encompasses innovation and destruction simultaneously, demonstrating both courage and horror, encompassing triumph and catastrophe. This narrative demands transmission, not celebrating warfare's glory, but advancing understanding that grasping our complicated history in complete richness and inherent contradiction constitutes foundation for successfully navigating what approaches. The compressed seconds available to Japanese officers for responding to incoming skip-bombing B-25s might appear trivial within World War II's immense narrative scope. Yet within those seconds, the Pacific conflict's trajectory crystallized, and thousands discovered their destinies irrevocably sealed.